It is 3 in the morning, on November 9th, 1979. Inside a mountain in Colorado, at the headquarters of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, every alarm in the building is going off at once. The screens are showing roughly 2,200 Soviet missiles in the air, on their way toward the United States. The trajectory is real. The trajectory is correct. The numbers match the doctrine for a full first strike. The men in the room have about 6 minutes to decide whether this is happening. 3 of those minutes have already passed. To understand what was happening that night, you need to know how the United States planned to detect a Soviet first strike in 1979. The system was called the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. It was a combination of 3 things: long-range radar stations in Alaska, Greenland, and the United Kingdom, several dozen satellites in high orbit, watching for the heat plume of a missile launch, and a central computer at Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado that combined all of that data and displayed it on screens for the officers on duty. If a launch was detected, the system would estimate the missile's trajectory and arrival time, classify them by number and target, and pass that information to the senior officer on duty. He had a very short list of things to do. First, call the president. Second, call the head of the Strategic Air Command, who would put bombers in the air. Third, alert the missile silos across the American Midwest to prepare for launch. The total time from initial detection to a fully authorized counterstrike was estimated, on paper, at about 10 minutes. Soviet missiles, traveling at the speeds of the era, would reach American soil in roughly 30. So in principle, the system gave you 20 minutes of headroom. In practice, on the night of November 9th, the headroom was not 20 minutes, it was about 3. At roughly 2:50 in the morning, the central computer at Cheyenne Mountain began reporting incoming Soviet missiles. The first reading was small, 2 missiles. Within seconds, the count climbed. 20, then 200, then over 2,000. This was not a partial strike. This was not a misfire. This was, according to the screen, the Soviet Union committing every long-range nuclear weapon it owned to a single coordinated attack. The senior officer on duty, an Air Force general named James Hardinger, was woken up. So was the duty officer at the Strategic Air Command. So was the Secretary of Defense. So, by protocol, was the National Security Advisor, a man named Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski was in his home in Washington when the phone rang. The voice on the other end told him that the United States was under attack. 220 Soviet ballistic missiles were inbound, classified as a likely first strike, with detonation expected over major American cities within roughly 20 minutes. Brzezinski's first instinct was to do exactly what the doctrine required. He needed to call the president, Jimmy Carter, and inform him so the president could authorize a retaliatory launch. There was one detail Brzezinski waited on before making that call. The Strategic Air Command was supposed to confirm the attack with a second independent source, specifically with a satellite network which would visually detect the heat signature of the missile launches from space. Brzezinski waited. The phone rang again. The satellites were not showing any launches. The radars in Alaska and Greenland were not showing any launches either. Only the central computer at Cheyenne Mountain was showing an attack. Every other independent sensor in the system was seeing a quiet, normal night. This created a brief, unbearable problem. The doctrine assumed that the central computer was the most reliable source. The radars and satellites were backup. If the computer said there was an attack, and the other sensors had simply not picked it up yet, you had wasted critical time waiting for confirmation that might not come until detonation. But if the computer was wrong, and you launched a retaliatory strike based on that, you would be the country that started a nuclear war. The men in the room debated for what one of them later described as the longest 3 minutes of his life. The screens still showed missiles. The other sensors still showed nothing. They held. At the 6-minute mark, the central computer's data started to soften. The trajectories began to look strange. The numbers stopped climbing. The pattern of incoming missiles, which had initially looked exactly like a textbook Soviet first strike, started to look just slightly too textbook, too clean, too perfect. At 7 minutes, the alarm was called off. At 7 minutes, Brzezinski hung up the phone without ever calling the president. The investigation that followed was thorough, and the answer was almost insulting in its simplicity. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, there was a training program. The Air Force ran regular simulations to test its detection systems. The simulations used a specific kind of magnetic tape loaded onto a specific machine designed to feed the central computer a synthetic scenario of a Soviet attack. The officers on duty would respond to the simulated attack as if it were real, and their response would be evaluated. On the night of November 9th, a technician had loaded one of these training tapes into a computer. The tape was running. The simulation was generating data. So far, nothing unusual. The problem was that the computer the tape had been loaded into was not the training computer. It was a backup machine for the live warning system. The data from the training tape was, by accident, being routed into the actual ballistic missile warning network. The screens at Cheyenne Mountain and at the Strategic Air Command and inside the White House Situation Room were displaying a simulated Soviet attack as if it were happening. The reason the radars and satellites did not confirm the attack was that there was no attack. The radars and satellites were doing their jobs perfectly. The central computer, also doing its job, was reporting exactly the data it had been fed. Nobody had told the central computer that the data was fake. This is, in the language of safety engineering, the worst possible kind of failure. The system was not broken. The system was working exactly as designed. It had simply been fed bad input by a technician who had loaded a tape into the wrong slot. The technician was not, at the time, on duty in any senior capacity. He was, by most accounts, doing routine maintenance work. Nobody has ever publicly identified him. He almost certainly never knew, until much later, how close he had come to ending civilization with a tape reel. In the months after the incident, the United States military made several changes. The training computers were physically separated from the live warning systems, with no possible way to route data between them. Procedures were rewritten so that any future incoming attack indication had to be confirmed by at least 2 independent sensor sources before a retaliatory launch could be authorized. The protocols around the National Security Advisor's call to the president were tightened. The incident was, for many years, classified. The American public was not told what had happened until 1980. And even then, only in vague outline. The full technical account did not become declassified and widely available until the early 2000s. The Soviet Union, of course, never knew any of this had happened. From their perspective, November 9, 1979, was a quiet night. This incident is one of at least 4 publicly documented false alarms in the American nuclear warning system between 1975 and 1990. The other 3 involved a faulty computer chip, a moonrise mistaken for missile launches, and a flock of geese. Each one came within minutes of triggering a real response. Each one was caught, mostly, by humans who were willing to question what the system was telling them. This channel has covered one of those people already. His name was Stanislav Petrov. He was the Soviet officer who, 4 years later, looked at his own screen and decided not to make the call. What you start to notice, after sitting with these stories long enough, is a pattern. Highly automated systems, with very short decision times, run by very serious people, in countries that hold tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, have repeatedly come within minutes of starting a war because a tape was loaded into the wrong slot, or a chip failed, or a flock of birds flew past a radar. Each time, the war was prevented by an individual person who paused, looked at the screen, and refused to trust it completely. These individual people are the safety mechanism. They are the only one that has worked, every time, for 50 years. And the systems they oversee are getting faster. Modern hypersonic weapons reduce the warning time from 30 minutes to under 15. Some proposed systems would shorten it further. The pressure on senior officers to act before independent confirmation arrives is greater than it has ever been. Which raises the question this channel has been asking, in different forms, video after video. How much of our world is currently held up by individual human judgment, in moments most of us will never hear about, against systems that were not designed with quite enough humility about their own potential failures? The honest answer, as always, is probably more than we think. Zbigniew Brzezinski died in 2017. The technician who loaded the tape that night has never been publicly named. Jimmy Carter was never told. And on November 9, 1979, the world quietly did not end. Because 3 or 4 men in a mountain in Colorado looked at a screen that said it was ending